right, we'll continue our study this morning with Hebrews chapter 9. If you'd like to turn over there. So Hebrews chapter 9. And we'll have a lot of reading to do today, so if you guys can kind of get your throats cleared and ready to help me read, that would be awesome. We've got a lot to do today, so I'll ask for some volunteers for that as we go through the class. We appreciate Larry doing chapter 8 last week, so I'll do 9 today and also chapter 10 next week with that as well. If I can keep this on, this one isn't custom fit for my ear there. So, all right, so Hebrews chapter 9. So today what we're going to be talking about is a continuation of, again, that sacrifice of Jesus being that much more superior than the sacrifices under the old law, and a lot of different topics along those lines that we've talked about several times. But this will be in a little different context this morning, at least with chapter 9 and how it's kind of brought forth there. So the Hebrew writer's been building throughout each chapter and each part of this letter, again, that Christ is greater. We talked about in Hebrews 1 that He's greater than the angels. Hebrews 3, we talked about that He's greater than Moses. And then Hebrews 7 talked about the Levitical priesthood and that the priesthood of Christ is greater. And then also the covenant or the law is more superior as well, that Larry talked about last week in chapter 8. So chapter 9, as we think about this today, we were going to be looking at the fact that the old law or the old covenant system was also not sufficient in what it did for the people at that time and for us today, but that Christ is the once and for all sacrifice. It's not only better, but His sacrifice is also final. So we know that there's not going to be any other laws coming after what we have now. It's the final law. It's the final sacrifice that we'll have throughout mankind when you think about that. So 2,000 years have already passed. This law has stood for that long, and it will continue to stand as long as God allows the earth to be here. Also, when we think about that, the original audience, the Jewish Christians that the book is written to, we've talked about and mentioned several times, they were tempted to leave the ways of the new law and go back to the old law. At this time, they were getting a little weak for various reasons, and we've covered a lot of those in detail. But they were wanting, or at least considering, going back to the physical law of the temple and the priest, sacrifices and all those things that they were used to. And they're still trying to understand that those things were just a shadow of what Jesus died for, and for that new law that they were under at that time, and that we continue to be under to this day. So we want to remember that Christ's sacrifice kind of points out three different things for us that we want to remember. That His sacrifice accomplished three things that the old law could never accomplish for us. One of those was the fact of true cleansing of the conscience. And we're going to talk about the conscience a little bit as we go throughout the lesson or the chapter today. So true cleansing of the conscience is one thing that the law couldn't do, the old law. Eternal redemption, when we think about that, and then that hope of heaven is what ultimately it leads to and gives us that assurance and that hope that we can have there. So just a few things to kind of keep in mind as we go throughout the lesson today in the chapter that we'll be looking at today. So we're going to start in Hebrews 9, verses 1 through 5, and I would love to have somebody volunteer to read that for us. So the first 5 verses of Hebrews chapter 9.
On all sides of the
Okay, so what's being described in these 5 verses? What is that Mark just read for us? Okay, all right, and it's pretty detailed here, at least as you know, from an overview standpoint of what the writer is telling us there, pointing out the different things that were in the tabernacle. Somebody just kind of describe the tabernacle as far as the layout of it and what and who could go in there. Just a real brief overview of that. Whose house was the tabernacle? All right, so it was God's house, right? So God tells us that He dwelled there during under the old law. Where did He dwell within the tabernacle? In the most holy place, right? So, and that was what? Was that where was that located within the tabernacle? In the center, all right. So, okay, behind the curtain. So, who could go into God at that time? Into the most holy place. Okay, so just the high priest. Well, but could anybody else go? Was anybody else qualified? How often could the high priest go in there? Once a year, okay? So when we think about being able to approach God, the Jewish people at that time had one person that could approach God for them. What did he do when he went into that room? What was the purpose of him going there? Okay, all right. So he was basically making intercession for the people to God through the sacrifices, and that were done, you know, before that and during that during those rituals there. So we think about, you know, how physical of a law that was, even to the point of the sacrifices, to the blood that was involved with those sacrifices, and then to the point of how the high priest went in to the most holy place there. So when we think about that, let's turn to Exodus chapter 25. If somebody would turn there, we've got one verse to read there. Exodus 25, verse 22. If someone could read that for us. Exodus 25, 22. Okay. All right. So again, we see here that as the high priest could go in, we see the things that were in that room. I was kind of thinking about how daunting that would be, at least for me. If I was a high priest and if we were under the old law, and I would go in there, and you've got the ark in there, the cherubims, and all the things that were mentioned there in the verses that we read. You know, what did Larry mention last week about a rope? Does anybody remember what Larry? He just mentioned that briefly last week. Yeah, so, you know, and so I was thinking about that a little bit this week, and I was thinking, how often did a high priest just fall over and die, and, you know, or they would have to do that. But nobody, if that happened, could go in and get him. But then also, you think about Uzzah. What did Uzzah do with the ark? He touched it, right? So, you know, not that, you know, obviously the high priest would know not to do that, but those things were so holy and set apart from everybody else, and to me, that would be would be a huge responsibility, and it would have been for the high priest to carry all of the burden of the people in there to God and with those sacrifices and prayers. But also when you think about that, so our relationship with God today is a lot different than what it was for you know, those of the Old Testament, than the Jews at that time. So only the high priest could approach God. They could not freely approach God. Can we freely approach God today? Okay, through Jesus. And how do we do that? Yeah, through prayer, right? So Jesus, as we've talked about many times, He's the one that makes intercession for us now. But we can approach God in that way and pray to God and also ask for forgiveness of our sins there. So again, as we think about the Hebrew Christians starting to get a little weak at this point, starting to second guess their decision to become Christians, this was just a night and day change from what they were used to, and being able to freely, you know, approach God through prayer in that way. And there's some other thoughts we'll talk about here in the next few minutes about that as well. But let's continue on. So Hebrews chapter 9, verses 6 through 10, if somebody would like to read that. We see that the Jewish law from several different avenues, they had a lot of limitations with that. So let's read Hebrews 9, 6 through 10. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. So we see again here, it just mentions again that the high priest went alone to the tabernacle once a year. And again, it was for the people's sins. But it mentions this phrase, committed in ignorance. What does that mean? Does anybody know what that phrase would mean? Sins committed in ignorance. Okay. All right. So how could that happen? Any ideas? Okay. All right. Okay. So some things that maybe you hadn't been taught under the old law that wasn't passed down from others there and that you had not learned. Let's somebody turn to Leviticus chapter 4 verse 2. Let's read one verse there. Those are mentioned there as well. Okay. All right. Thanks, Dan. So again, we see here an unintentional sin. So they had ways of of those sins being taken care of there, and also with the Day of Atonement in Numbers chapter 15 also talks about that a little bit as well. But anyway, so those were mentioned there. Also, it talks about really again that physical service of the old law there. So it talks about gifts that people were. There were so many rules. We have rules today too, but there were so many little rules and things that they had to follow. And it got to the point where they were more concerned about doing things exactly right, which they should have been, but not really having any kind of relationship or a lot of faith that they should have had to go with that. So it says there that the gifts and sacrifices were offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect. So we know those things couldn't make them perfect or couldn't cleanse them. And then it also says concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances, thinking about that. So again, those physical rules that God set in place for them, but they got to the point where they were just so focused on those things and not that of the awesomeness and greatness of God there. Even though he offered blood for his own sins, when you think about for the sins of the high priest, and also he offered blood for that of the people, it still was not enough to cleanse them there. And we know that these rituals were temporary, they were external, so more of just, again, that physical nature, and they were incomplete. We know that God commanded these things to be done, but there would be a lot more to do as Jesus came along in his life and what is to be done since that time. Somebody turn to Romans chapter 3, verse 20 for me. Romans chapter 3, verse 20. Okay. All right. So again, you could not be justified by the old law there. And then also in Matthew chapter 23, verse 25, it talks about the old law being similar to the washing of a cup. Does anybody remember what that was talking about in Matthew chapter 23? It was talking about the law and cleansing and the washing of a cup. What did that mean? Okay, all right, that's exactly right. So just like that of washing of a cup there and washing the outside of it, but the inside was still dirty, or the people in comparison to that, their conscience remained guilty in that way. So how do you think the limitations of the old law, how do you think that left the Jews wanting something greater or even something better, like we talk about with the book of Hebrews? So they had these limitations, but why do you think they needed something more, even not only from just God's standpoint, but from them as Jewish people at that time? And it goes back to what we mentioned a little earlier about their conscience. So their conscience was what? They would have sin, they would make the sacrifices, but where did it leave their conscience? Okay, all right, so they performed the ritual, but they still had the guilt on their conscience for the sins that they committed. So they would think about those sins, and then they would have the sacrifices, but the sacrifices meant they had to kill a living thing, right? So they had to kill a lamb or their sacrifice to God. So not only did they have the sin on their minds, and they knew that was wrong, but then they had to also sacrifice a living animal to make up for their sins in that way. So they had the guilt from that. They had the guilt from this that they had to continually do every year. And it left them wanting something more or needing something more because they could never really have that peace that we can have today, knowing that their sins were forgiven there. So you kind of think about how that whole process would be. And if you were one making that sacrifice, or if I had to sacrifice a lamb, that wouldn't make my conscience feel any better about the things I'd done, that were wrong. To me, it would just magnify that even more. But again, so that guilt is something that they had to live with. Do we still have guilt today, though, after we sin? It's only natural for the guilt to stay with us on when we do something wrong. We can pray for that to be lifted. We can pray for those things to be eased. But a lot of times it's hard to let go of things like that, even after we've been forgiven. So again, it's something we all, even from just a human nature standpoint, we have to deal with. But when we talk about the hope of Jesus and the hope of heaven and the hope that God gives us, we can, when we are forgiven for that, we should do our best to let it go. And try to move on there. And these verses, chapter 9 talks a lot about having our conscience cleansed and clean in that way. So, all right, let's continue. So Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 15, if somebody could read that for us. All right, thank you for that, Tom. So appreciate everybody reading this morning for us. So we see here that Christ entered into heaven itself after his death. It's not an earthly copy or an earthly house of any sort. We know that Jesus is on the right hand of God. He offered his own blood, not animal blood. So we know that, again, when we talk about that sacrifice being greater, it's not from an animal. We know that it's from Jesus, the most ultimate sacrifice that could be done for us. especially in that he lived that perfect life. So his sacrifices do cleanse the conscience and not just the flesh. So again, the blood and bulls and goats that's talked about here, again, that's a fleshly thing. It's not one of a spiritual thing, one of a conscience, from a conscience standpoint. When we think about that, and the result of that is again eternal redemption. So we can be redeemed, through Jesus' blood that He shed for us. And I was thinking about the lesson this week as far as again, all of these things, even just in 11 through 15, with the blood and bulls and goats and all of the things that they had to do. It made me wonder if maybe they were thinking that being a Christian was a little too easy. They had done all of these things and kept all of these parts of the law all of their lives. And now we're moving into this spiritual, transformation for them, to where the law that they're now under and now serving is that of spiritual, and they don't have to worry about all these little things. And maybe it made them, I'm just speaking on my own here, but maybe it made them a little nervous, thinking that it's almost night and day on what they had to do. That maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe they felt like the things that they were doing was not enough, since they were so used to all those actual tasks that they had to do. But if that was the case, again, we all have things to do. It's just not from a physical standpoint in that way, but we all have spiritual things that we can do, and then also a lot of work that we have to do, from a teaching standpoint that all of us should be involved in, from a worship standpoint that we should be doing, not only on the first day of the week, but always in prayer to God in that way. So just some thoughts on that. Let's turn to a couple passages. If somebody would turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. And then if somebody else could turn to John 1:29, that would be great. So 1 Peter 1, 18 and 19. Okay, all right, and then also John 1:29 for us.
The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world."
Okay, all right, so again, we see that Jesus, with His death, takes away our sins, took away our sins there, and so that was pointed out there in the book of John. Here's just kind of a question for you. So what is the difference between being forgiven and being cleansed? Is there a difference in those two ideas? Being forgiven and being cleansed. What's being forgiven mean to you? What do you think about when we think about being forgiven? Any thoughts? Okay, all right. So the debt of sin is released from us with no penalty when we think about being forgiven. So let's compare that now to that of being cleansed. What does it mean to be cleansed? To be washed, and go just a little further with that. Washed and clean, or made pure inside and out. So not like the cup that we talked about earlier, but if we're cleansed, we're clean inside and out. Our heart is clean, and we live that of a clean life there. So, all right, let's continue on then. Hebrews 9, 16 and 17. Someone would read, or actually 9, 16 through 22, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, so out of this section, we'll just focus on verses 16 and 17 for a minute. So as we think about verses 16 and 17, if you've been a member of the church for much time at all, you've heard preachers talk about 16 and 17 a lot. Somebody, in a nutshell, kind of explain that those two verses to us, where it talks about there's a testament, there must also be the necessity of the death of the testator, and continuing on. Somebody give us just a little brief overview of that. Okay, all right. And how did he do that? Okay, all right. So with his death and resurrection, so he enacted God's law. What's the last part of verse 16 mean? It talks about the death of the testator.
I think another word for covenant or will would be will. There's no will today. And the will is go forth until it dies. So the will of God in this case is forth in Jesus'
Okay, all right. So why is that important in two ways? Why was that important for the people during Jesus' time, even while Jesus was alive? And why is that important for us today? Remember who's being spoken to here, written to with this letter. So the Jewish Christians, again, were getting weak from thinking they needed to go back to that of their previous life. But the death of Jesus with his will caused the new law to be put into place. It didn't happen before he died. It happened after he died. And the new law was set in place at that time. So again, that was reassurance to them, to the Hebrew Christians there, that the new law is upon them. It had started. They knew, just like we do today, how a will would have worked. If someone passed away, then the things would pass on to them. Same way in this situation. Once Jesus died, his will went into effect there. So. All right, somebody look over it, or I'll just read this. Matthew 26, verse 28 says, "For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." And we read that a lot during the Lord's Supper talks. But again, Jesus' blood was shed for all of our remissions of sin and for this law to begin. All right, we'll continue on. We're about out of time here. So Hebrews 9, 23 through 28. Somebody would like to read that.
Therefore, it is necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with Jesus, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true which is heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now once at the consummation of the age, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself, inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, after this comes judgment. So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him.
All right, so when we think about that, we think about, again, Jesus being offered only one time. It's mentioned again in these verses that his offering was a one-time thing that had to be done. It was final. It wasn't like the annual sacrifices that they had to do under the old law. So that's kind of brought forth again in those 5 verses there. And also, though, we think about Christ being offered for all, his sacrifice put away sin forever. So for anybody that lived from the day that he rose and set in the new law for us today, it applies to everybody. So not only the 2,000 years we've talked about, but forever long, the world continues. It applies to all people then and now, and moving forward. So again, he put away the sin forever there. But we know Jesus will return. And when he returns, he's not dealing with sin anymore when he comes back. What's going to happen when Jesus comes back? What's the purpose at that point? Yeah, to bring judgment to the earth. So the sacrifice for sin that he gave is done, it's over, and when he comes back, it'll be time for that of judgment and to bring salvation to those that have followed him. Somebody turn to 1 Peter 3, verse 18 for us. 1 Peter 3:18.
Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, and who was put to death in the flesh, and made alive in the spirit.
Okay, thank you. So we know that the Bible tells us a lot. Everything that the Bible tells us is certain. These things are going to happen. If they haven't happened yet, they're going to happen. And we think about this, the coming of Jesus. We know two things are going to happen there. That Jesus is going to come back, and we have that certainty of judgment that we just mentioned a moment ago. So when we think about those two things, how should that affect the urgency of faith that we live? So we know that judgment is coming. We know that Jesus is coming back. How should that affect our lives today? Yep, very good. We should be ready. So ready for what? Yep, and then how can we be ready? Okay, all right. What should our lives look like if we're living that life in that way? What should our lives look like from a daily basis or on a daily basis? Okay, righteous. So how do we live a righteous life on a daily basis? What should we be doing? One more time. Okay, all right. So our lives should be focused on Christ, eagerly waiting. We know we talked about earlier in the chapter that we have that hope that we have. And we have that assurance that if we are eagerly waiting and we're living for Christ, that we can have that eternal life with the Lord. All right, so just kind of in conclusion, so Hebrews chapter 9, we know it teaches us, again, just that as a wrap-up, that the rituals cannot save us today. It couldn't save the Hebrew Christians. That time had passed, so they were trying to make that transition there. So. And then we also mentioned here that Christ's sacrifice was better, it was final, it was eternal, and he cleanses our conscience and secures our redemption there, and then again gives us that hope that we talked about. For the first century Christians, this was a call and a reminder for them to remain faithful to Christ and not drift back to the things that were just really, like we talked about, they were just shadows of what was to come, and that had already come to them. Again, it was a reminder to them to not drift back to those shadows of things with that. And it's a reminder for us as well. So if Christ's blood has secured our redemption once and for all, then we must live confidently and eagerly wait his return that Pam just mentioned there. So any other questions or comments you'd like to make before we finish up this morning? All right, we appreciate everybody's comments and reading and the help this morning, and we'll see you guys back this evening.